Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. Today I've got a really, I think, fun, compelling little craft video today, and I'm going to be talking about the 3 planes of story theory. Now, you may be asking yourself as you get into this video, who is the creator of this brilliant theory? Who's the originator, the brilliant originator, and where can I read more of their works? Well, you're looking at them right here. Yeah, this is just my own little theory, which maybe means it's not very good. It certainly means that there's probably more room for refining. Just something I've been thinking of lately, and I wanted to make a video about it. So the main idea here is that there are 3 different planes to a story: the concrete plane, the internal plane, and the metaphorical plane. Different elements of a story exist on different planes, and a story's causality and meaning weaves between these different planes and the relationship between certain elements that affect each other across the 3 different planes. Is this a perfect, refined theory, master's thesis, peer-reviewed? No, this is just something that I thought of and wrote on the notes app of my phone. But I'm a giant writing craft nerd, and I know y'all are too. That's why you watch videos about writing in your spare time. So I was hoping today we could just kind of geek out about writing craft for a bit. So let's start by talking about these 3 different planes and what they are. So number 1 is the concrete plane. This is anything in a story that is physically happening. It's the scenes and events, a character's interactions, the dialogue, it's the interpersonal conflict, anything that is physically happening in a story, right? If it was a movie, you could see it happening. It's not up for interpretation. The second plane is the internal plane. This is everything that's happening within the protagonist's mind. These things are mostly perceptible to the protagonist, but they wouldn't necessarily be visible to another character. These are things that are all happening within the protagonist's mind. Internal narrative, everything that's within the point of view, emotion, desires, goals, motivations, internal conflict, your character's perceptions of other characters, basically everything that your protagonist is thinking. And every single character in a book has this internal plane, but as the reader, we're tuned in only to the internal plane of our point of view character or point of view characters. In an omniscient narrator, maybe we kind of are getting access to everyone, but in a limited point of view, maybe that's only one character. These things that are on the internal plane are known to the reader and known to the protagonist, but they're not necessarily known to other characters, and you can perceive it visually. I think there's a little bubble reality now tucked in between the internal plane and the metaphorical plane, which is the subtext. These are things that are known to the protagonist but are implicit, so not explicitly stated to the reader. I think it kind of depends. You could say that goes in the internal plane or the metaphorical plane, maybe depending on the case. And then finally we have the metaphorical plane. So these are things that are implied and perceptible to a reader, but not stated, and often not perceptible or known to the characters. If something is a symbol, the reader might be perceiving that it's a symbol, but the character is probably not perceiving that it's a symbol. The character is perceiving their own internal relationship and importance to that thing, but not necessarily that it's a symbol in the story. So the metaphorical plane has, metaphors, symbols, ideas, themes, and any kind of symbolic or idealistic conflict. So if the conflict of your story is making a larger statement about ideas or themes or topics, then that's on the metaphorical plane. So this is actually kind of the difference between an object that's in the story and a symbol. An object just exists on the physical plane. It's just on the physical plane, it serves its role. But once an object is physical on the concrete plane of a story and also has meaning on the metaphorical plane, that's how you end up with a symbol or a metaphor. These things should reflect each other, right? What's being said on the metaphorical plane should reflect and align with what's happening on the concrete plane, right? Again, if your story is exploring themes or topics, or there's a metaphor, the way that works is things that are happening in the story are representative of ideas, which is then reflected on the metaphorical plane in a way that cohesively says what you're trying to say. So we can use this to look at different types of connections through plot points. So in a very plotty novel, a novel that is very plot heavy, maybe plot driven, some might say, the events will be primarily connected through the concrete plane. So the way we're moving from scene A to scene B to scene C to scene D and creating a cohesive arc through the story is because of things happening on the concrete plane in scene A cause things that happen in the concrete plane in scene B, and that's where our causal connections are. We have concrete causal connections. And on the flip side, in a very internal novel, maybe a very character-driven novel, some ways may say, you may have scenes that are connected through the internal plane, but not through the concrete plane. So scene A doesn't cause scene B through external factors, but due to internal factors to the character, the character's emotions, the character's desires. So rather than something happens in scene A which causes the thing that happened in scene B directly, it's skirting up through that internal plane. So if something happens in scene A that causes the character to feel a certain way, which causes them to act a certain way, which causes scene B. There may not be external causality, but there's internal causality. And most books are going to have both, right? Many events will be connected through both. You may have events that are connected through one of these planes, all three of these planes, just two of these planes, and it's not necessarily going to be the same all through the novel, right? If you're trying to track a novel's causal connections, you may have different types of causal connections on all these different planes throughout the book. Where the focus of the conflict is external, internal, or more so symbolic or idea-driven, may create patterns in the types of connections you see the most often, but most books will have a huge range of the types of connections that you see. Some very experimental work might be primarily connected through the metaphorical plane. If you're writing something very cerebral and experimental, there may not even be much internal causality for the main character, but what's connecting your scenes is based on the themes and the ideas in the book, and that's what's moving you throughout the story. That's something you see in the most experimental, very heady work. You're not going to see that in a typical plot-driven novel most of the time. But it could happen. You could have a story where those causal connections are on that metaphorical plane. So what do these different types of connections look like? Let's look at some examples. I'm really bad at coming up with examples. Just want to apologize. These are all pretty obvious, very blatant, but I think they kind of had to be blatant to show these things in a really clear, clean way. So first of all, let's look at a concrete causal connection. So in scene A, Bob, our main character, is trying to get to his best friend's wedding. He's running behind, and so he speeds so fast that he crashes the car. In the next scene, we see him trying to hitchhike to get there on time. So these things are connected based on the concrete plane, right? He's speeding, which is a concrete thing, which causes him to crash, which is a concrete thing that physically happens. And so now he has to find a new way to get to the wedding, so he tries to hitchhike. Look in any more plot-driven story and you'll see these clear concrete connections abundantly, ideally, because that means that you have a strong, structurally related, connected book, right? Any book with a strong plot, strong structure should have really clear causal connections of this type. Look at any plot structure. This is what plot structures tend to lay out. The hero's journey, Save the Cat. They're typically laying out the concrete connections between events. And then what's up to the writer is to fill in and create their own original, unique internal connections and metaphorical connections. Sometimes plot structures do consider internal connections as well. They consider character development, but usually they're examples of tight, concrete plot structuring. What about a connection that's connected on internal means? So this is basically, these events are connected based on what the character feels. So let's say we have this situation, our main character, Kate, and she feels trapped in the small town she's lived in her entire life. In scene A, she finds out that her older sister, who left the family behind to start a career, has been nominated for a big award. Maybe let's say that they had the same career aspirations, or maybe even Kate had this career aspiration first as a child, but her sister kind of jumped on board and ended up going to live the life that she always wanted. And scene B is Kate goes through her sister's belongings that she left behind and starts breaking them. Her sister winning the award doesn't cause, through a concrete physical chain of events, the main character now breaking all her stuff. Those things are related because of the main character's emotional state. The main character is having an emotional reaction based on her complexes that is causing her to do this thing. It's an emotional reaction based on what she feels. So scene A causes an emotional reaction. That emotional reaction causes scene B. It's not event causes event, it's event causes emotional reaction causes event. What about connections on the metaphorical plane? I will admit this was extremely difficult to think of an example for, but this is what I came up with. So sorry, it's pretty blatant. We'll say that the theme of the story is even in moments of tragedy, good will triumph over evil. So let's say we have scene A. So our protagonist, Michael, comes home and finds that someone has broken in and killed his pet duck. So scene B, as he's mourning his precious pet duck, the duck's eggs begin to hatch. And he realizes that his duck had hidden the eggs to protect them when she realized she was in danger. And the ducklings bond with him because he's their new mother. This connection between these events, I mean, this is also concrete, right? But the connection we're emphasizing is the metaphorical, right? The one about theme. The theme is that even in this moment of tragedy, the good will triumph over evil. The duck did an act of goodness to protect her ducklings. Michael will raise them as his own little duckling babies. So this is obviously very much an oversimplification of a pretty complicated set of connections that will exist within a story. A scene, like I said, could be connected on all these planes or have a lot of different, like, very complicated types of connections, but that was kind of some really blatant ones. These types of connections also explain how we get things like fabulous writing. Fabulous writing versus, say, high fantasy. So in a fabulous writing, there's magic. The magic doesn't have concrete logic, but what it has is metaphorical logic. So in fabulous writing, you might have magical events, and they're explained and connected based on that metaphorical plane, based on what they represent. That's the difference between fabulism and fantasy. In fantasy, the magic has concrete rules that has consistency on the concrete plane. Fabulism is finding its connections on the metaphorical plane. So it still has consistency, right? Magic in fabulism may feel very soft, but it still has consistency. It's just a different type of consistency than you would get in like a hard magic system in a high fantasy novel, where that magic is being used for plot events and it has it's a clear set of rules, right? That's very concrete. The magic in that case is being used to serve plot purposes, so it needs that. If your magic is serving more metaphorical purposes, you might have more soft or fabulous magical events because it's not about the concrete causality. Their meaning, their purpose is actually rooted in the metaphorical. All these layers of a story kind of reflect one another. Ideally, they all interact. They're not separate things. They all weave together, right? You have concrete things happening in the story which are deepened by and explained by and given purpose based on everything happening in the main character's internal world and internal lens. And then those things are given symbolic meaning based on how they interact on the metaphorical plane. Concretely, there's what's happening. Internally, there's how the protagonist is perceiving it. And then symbolically, there's what does it all mean. So that's all for my little chat on this topic, this cool brain melty topic. I'm gonna have my work cut out for me with making the graphs for this one. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!